It started with laughter and almost ended in lawyers. For years, Islands in the Stream was known as one of the happiest duets ever recorded. A love song so smooth, so effortless, it made the whole world believe Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers had bottled lightning in a studio. But behind that joy, behind the easy smiles and soft harmonies, there was a storm quietly brewing. Because what started as a friendship between three music legends almost turned into a legal fight over ownership, royalties, and respect. And at the center of it all was Dolly Parton, the one woman in country music who refused to be silenced, even by the men who wrote the song. Most fans never knew it. They saw the smiles, the interviews, the warm stories of friendship. But what they didn't see were the contracts, the licensing deals, the quiet phone calls between lawyers. Because once the money started rolling in, and the song began showing up in places Dolly never approved, she realized something wasn't right. Her voice was everywhere, but her name buried beneath the fine print, and the man she blamed wasn't her duet partner, Kenny Rogers. It was the man behind the music, Gibb of the Bee Gees. For a time, things got so tense that friends of both stars whispered about lawsuits, and though no papers were ever filed, those whispers weren't fiction. They were warnings. If the next phone call had gone differently, the world might have seen something unthinkable. Dolly Parton versus Gibb in court. You're watching RetroWaves, where the biggest stories in music history come alive. Let's rewind to the song that turned a perfect duet into a near disaster. It all began far from Nashville, in a Miami studio run by the Gibb brothers. Barry, Robin, and Maurice Gibb were trying to reinvent themselves after the disco backlash of the late 1970s. Their hits had ruled the world, but by 1983, disco had become a dirty word, and radio stations were turning against them. So Barry looked for something new, something softer. He began writing for other artists. One of those songs was Islands in the Stream. Inspired by an Ernest Hemingway novel of the same name, Barry originally wrote it for Marvin Gaye as a silky, soulful R&B number, but fate had other plans. Around that same time, Barry was producing a new album for Kenny Rogers, titled Eyes That See in the Dark. He played Kenny the song. Kenny liked it, sort of. He later admitted, "We tried it, but it just didn't feel right. I didn't like how it sounded." Kenny tried singing it alone. It fell flat. He tried rearranging it. Still nothing. After a few frustrating takes, he was ready to drop it entirely. That's when Barry had a wild idea. What if it were a duet, he said. And someone in the studio, no one's sure who, said two words that changed everything. Call Dolly. Within hours, Dolly Parton, who just happened to be in the same city, walked into the studio, radiant, confident, and completely unaware that she was about to make history. Kenny later recalled that moment vividly. She walked in, and suddenly, the energy changed. We started again from the top, and the moment she sang her first line, it just clicked. It was magic. They nailed it in one take. When Islands in the Stream was released in August 1983, it rocketed to #1, not just on the country charts, but on Billboard's Hot 100. It was one of the rare songs to conquer every genre at once: pop, country, and adult contemporary. It became one of the best-selling duets in history. But as the applause faded, the business began. Because while Dolly and Kenny were the voices, Barry was the owner, and ownership in music is where the trouble always starts. To understand why Dolly almost sued Barry, you have to understand how the music industry works. When you write a song, you own the publishing rights. When you record it, that's another right entirely, the master recording. Barry Gibb, along with his brothers Robin and Maurice, owned the publishing rights through their company, Gibb Brothers Music. That meant they controlled where the song could appear, how it could be used, and who got paid when it was performed or licensed. Dolly and Kenny, on the other hand, were paid as performers, not songwriters. They were paid for the recording sessions and earned royalties from sales and radio play of that specific version. But the long-term publishing profits, those belonged to the Bee Gees. Normally, that wouldn't have been an issue. Dolly knew the business better than most. She'd built her empire by holding on to her own publishing, famously keeping the rights to I Will Always Love You. But when Islands in the Stream began appearing in compilations, commercial syncs, and medleys, sometimes without her direct approval, Dolly started asking questions. Because suddenly, her voice, her unmistakable sound, was being used in ways she hadn't signed off on. In one case, an international compilation reportedly used her vocals without notifying her team in advance. That's when the first tension began to surface. Berry wasn't personally making those decisions, the publishing department was. But from Dolly's perspective, it didn't matter. Her image, her sound, her voice, they were being used, and she wasn't being asked. And if there's one thing Dolly Parton doesn't tolerate, it's losing control over her art. People close to her described her as furious. Not loud, not explosive, just cold, determined fury. She felt blindsided, one Nashville insider said. She loved Berry, but she was angry at how her work was being handled. It wasn't about money, it was about respect. For a while she tried to handle it quietly. Then, when the licensing kept expanding and her management saw deals they hadn't approved, the word lawyers started coming up. And suddenly, this happy duet didn't feel so happy anymore. By 1985, Islands in the Stream had become more than a hit. It was a cultural moment. It played in diners, echoed from jukeboxes, and even appeared in movie soundtracks. But behind that endless success, business wheels were spinning, wheels Dolly hadn't turned herself. One day, her manager brought her news that left her stunned. Several compilation albums released across Europe had used Islands in the Stream without so much as a courtesy call. Dolly's team hadn't signed off, hadn't reviewed contracts, hadn't been consulted, and even though the songwriters, Berry, Robin, and Maurice, owned the publishing, Dolly believed her performance gave her certain rights too. Her voice was, after all, part of the master recording. So she made a phone call. Not to Barry Gibb, at least not yet. First, she called her lawyers. Within days, a quiet but serious discussion began between her camp and the Bee Gees publishing office. Lawyers started trading documents and terms like mechanical royalties and master licensing. It was all polite at first, but soon things grew sharp. Because Dolly wasn't asking for special treatment, she was demanding respect. She wasn't just the singer, she was half the reason the song had become legendary. And yet decisions about her voice, her very sound, were being made by people she'd never met. Those close to her said she was calm but firm. "I don't want my voice used without my say-so," she told her team. "I've worked too hard to hand that over." Barry, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. He was busy producing for other artists, completely unaware that one of his most successful collaborations was turning into a legal storm. By the time the issue reached him, the situation was already tense. There was confusion, frustration, and more than anything, hurt feelings. He reportedly reached out to Dolly through a mutual friend, trying to smooth things over, but by then the lawyers were already in motion, and once they're involved, it's hard to stop the momentum. To understand why Dolly reacted so strongly, you have to know one thing about her. She's built her career on ownership. In the 1970s, Elvis Presley wanted to record her song, "I Will Always Love You." Dolly was thrilled until Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, demanded half the publishing rights. Dolly said no. People called her crazy for turning down Elvis, but she stood her ground. Years later, when Whitney Houston recorded the song and turned it into one of the biggest hits in history, Dolly earned millions and the respect of an entire industry. So when she saw Islands in the Stream being used without her involvement, it struck the same nerve. She might not have written it, but she'd given it a soul. In private, she was said to have told her team, "If I sing it, it's part of me." You don't just pass that around like a piece of paper. Her lawyers explored what they could do. Could they claim performers' rights under U.S. and international law? Could they restrict licensing of the master recording? They prepared letters, not lawsuits, but legal warnings, enough to send a message. And that message reached Barry's circle. Barry Gibb was shocked. He admired Dolly deeply. He'd often said she was the easiest collaborator he'd ever worked with. No ego, no drama, just pure talent. To hear she was upset felt personal. According to one associate, Barry immediately offered to speak to her directly, to clear the air, but Dolly declined the call at first. She wanted things done properly, through her lawyers. It wasn't about anger, it was about boundaries. Behind her soft laugh and southern charm, Dolly has always been steel. She once said, "I may look artificial, but I'm real where it counts." And in this case, that realness meant business. By 1986, Islands in the Stream had generated millions. It was still topping international charts, and both Dolly and Kenny were performing it live to adoring crowds. But the financial side of things, The publishing, royalties, and residuals had grown tangled. Barry Gibb's publishing arm was managing new licensing requests from Europe and Asia. Some were straightforward, others not so much. When Dolly's management team reviewed the royalty statements, they noticed discrepancies. Fees missing, performance rights unclear, foreign usage not tracked correctly. For most artists, that's just paperwork. But for Dolly, every cent represented ownership, not greed, control. People around her said she felt like she was watching a familiar pattern repeat, men making business decisions about her art, assuming she'd just go along. But she wasn't the same small-town singer who once walked into Nashville with a guitar and a dream. She was Dolly Parton, a global star who owned her own publishing company, film studio, and brand. And she was ready to remind everyone of that. Her legal team drafted another letter, firmer this time. They didn't threaten a lawsuit outright, but they hinted at it. Words like violation, misuse, and potential damages began appearing in correspondence. Those words were enough to get Barry's attention. When the message reached him, Barry reportedly said, "This has gone too far. Let me talk to her." What followed was one of the most important private conversations in pop country history, the one that stopped a potential lawsuit before it could begin. The phone calls quieted, but the whispers didn't. By the late 1980s, Nashville and Los Angeles were buzzing with a story that Dolly Parton had prepared to sue Barry Gibb over Islands in the Stream. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. No lawsuit was ever filed. Yet, people close to Dolly confirmed that her lawyers did draft preliminary legal documents, a just-in-case move. Those papers never left the office drawer, but their existence was enough for someone to talk. A few music journalists caught wind, and before long, the headlines began to spin. Dolly and Barry at odds over million-dollar duet, the song that split country and pop apart. For two artists known for kindness and professionalism, it was humiliating. Dolly never commented directly, but when a reporter asked if she'd ever sue a fellow artist, she smiled and said softly, "I believe in solving things with a good talk, not a good lawyer." It was classic Dolly, charming, evasive, but pointed. She wasn't denying the tension, she was saying it didn't need to go public. Barry, meanwhile, stayed silent. He was never one for gossip, but those who knew him said he was deeply hurt that things had gotten so far. To him, Islands in the Stream was a gift, a way to share Bee Gees' songwriting with new audiences. He adored Dolly, respected her power, and never wanted to exploit her. But business doesn't always respect friendship, and when lawyers get involved, even goodwill starts to sound like accusation. By the early 90s, the issue had cooled, but the rumor, it lived on, whispered, exaggerated, and retold until it became a kind of urban legend, a story about how one of music's happiest duets almost turned into a courtroom drama. 15 years passed. Then suddenly, in 1998, the song that once symbolized harmony was back in the charts, this time under a different name. Ghetto Superstar, That Is What You Are, by Pras Muya and Old Dirty Bastard, took the world by storm. Its beat, that unmistakable melody from Islands in the Stream. Barry Gibb and his brothers were credited as songwriters and earned a fresh round of royalties. Dolly and Kenny weren't because they hadn't written it. Still, the moment was bittersweet. Dolly heard the song and reportedly smiled, but privately, it stirred something. Her voice had been the heartbeat of Islands in the Stream, and now that melody was reborn in a new era without her. She later told friends, half jokingly, "Seems like that song's gonna outlive us all. Just wish I'd kept a tighter leash on it." The comment was lighthearted, but the undertone was clear. She'd learned her lesson years earlier, and now that old frustration came rushing back. Rumors flared up again. Dolly's angry about Ghetto Superstar. Tabloids claimed she wants her share. None of it was ever confirmed. In fact, she praised the new artists for their creativity. But fans noticed the irony. The song that once caused a near-legal fight was now being celebrated by a whole new generation, and it was the Gibbs, not Dolly, who reaped the rewards. If Dolly was bitter, she never showed it. Instead, she turned the experience into wisdom. In interviews later, she said, "You can't own what people feel when they hear your voice, but you can make sure they never forget who you are," and that's exactly what she did. Sometime in the early 2000s, long after the storm had passed, Dolly and Barry met again, face to face. It happened backstage at a music awards event. By then, both were older, wiser, and surrounded by the weight of legacy. The Bee Gees had lost Maurice. Kenny Rogers was nearing retirement. Dolly was, as always, a glowing constant in the music world, timeless, untouchable, and fiercely independent. Those who saw the meeting described it as emotional. They hugged like old friends who had been through a war together, not with each other, but with the business that often pits artists against the very people they love. Barry reportedly told her, "That song wouldn't have meant anything without you." And Dolly, smiling through tears, replied, "And it wouldn't have lived without you." It was an unspoken truce, an acknowledgement that both had been right in their own ways. Dolly had every reason to demand control. Barry had every right to protect his creation. But above all, they both knew the song had outgrown them. It belonged to the world now. For a brief moment, the tension of the past melted away, replaced by something purer, respect. And in that silence, you could almost hear the faint echo of their voices, intertwined forever. Islands in the stream, that is what we are. To the world, Islands in the Stream was just a love song, a sweet, catchy duet between two icons of the 1980s. But behind the scenes, it became something much bigger, a story about power, respect, and the right to be heard. Most fans never realized that for years, Dolly Parton fought quietly for that right. Not in front of cameras, not with angry headlines, but through contracts, letters, and long conversations that shaped the future of music ownership. She once said in an interview, "I never wanted to fight anybody. I just want to know where my songs and my voice go." It was a small sentence that said everything, because for women in music, especially in the 1980s, control was the ultimate victory. While others saw Islands in the Stream as just another hit, Dolly saw it as proof that even when you don't write the song, your contribution matters. Your voice is your signature, and no one should use it without your say. And Barry Gibb, he learned something too. He'd spent his whole life as the songwriter, the man in control, but through this experience, he began to understand what it meant to be on the other side, to feel the vulnerability of giving your art to the business machine. Years later, he'd often speak about collaboration with a new tone, one shaped by humility. He called Dolly a once-in-a-lifetime partner, someone who could turn any song into something holy. The public never saw the contracts or the conflicts. All they saw were smiles. But every time Dolly sang Islands in the Stream after that, she sang it with ownership, emotional, not legal, but every bit as powerful, because she didn't just want to be remembered as the woman who sang it, she wanted to be remembered as the woman who stood up for it. No one filed a lawsuit, no courtroom showdown ever happened, but the idea of it, the fact that it almost did, changed everything. After that near conflict, major record labels began re-examining their contracts with artists, particularly around performance rights. Dolly's insistence that her voice couldn't be licensed or repackaged without approval became a model for future performers, especially women, to demand the same. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was revolutionary. Behind the curtain of what looked like a friendly collaboration, Dolly Parton quietly altered the way artists protect their work. She made the industry rethink what ownership really means, and Barry Gibb, to his credit, respected that. He could have fought back, hidden behind legal teams or corporate language. Instead, he extended grace, choosing peace over pride. Their almost feud ended not with a signature on a lawsuit, but with something stronger, understanding, because both of them in their own ways were fighting for the same thing, to be respected as creators. And that's what made the near lawsuit so historic. It wasn't about money, it was about the power to say, "This is mine." Time, as it always does, softened the edges. By the 2010s, both Dolly and Barry were living legends, symbols of an era when melody mattered more than fame. When Kenny Rogers passed away in 2020, Dolly was heartbroken. At his memorial, she performed Islands in the Stream one last time, her voice trembling, her smile bittersweet. Fans cried. And somewhere out there, Barry Gibb watched too. He later said in an interview, "Hearing her sing that again reminded me of everything we shared. The laughter, the music, the love. That's what matters, nothing else." The world will never see the letters, the legal drafts, or the tension that once surrounded that song. But it doesn't need to, because when Dolly sings it now, it's not just a duet, it's a memory, a promise that music, no matter how tangled the business gets, still has the power to heal. And maybe that's why Islands in the Stream endures, because it's more than just a song about love. It's a song that survived misunderstanding, money, and pride. It's proof that even when the harmony breaks, true artists always find their way back to it. You've been watching RetroWaves, where the biggest stories in music history come alive.